James Parker loved the isolation of his lakeside cabin, a place where the wind moved through the tall pines and the water carried reflections of a sky untouched by the noise of the world. He had bought the entire valley decades earlier, long before the HOA subdivision rose on the distant ridge, but he never bothered mentioning that fact to anyone. People tended to complicate things when they learned a man owned more land than they could fathom, and James preferred living quietly, far from arguments and attention. On a warm evening he sat on the edge of his dock, sipping coffee while the sun dipped beneath the tree-line. The peace broke when headlights appeared on the dirt road, followed quickly by the flash of blue emergency lights. Two sheriff's deputies stepped out, hands resting on their belts as they approached cautiously. One of them spoke politely, explaining that a neighbor had reported suspicious activity at the cabin, claiming a trespasser might be living here without permission. James understood immediately who it must have been. The HOA president, Karen Whitmore, had a reputation even he had heard about, despite avoiding interactions with the subdivision. She believed every square foot near the lake fell under her authority, and she was known for inserting herself into situations that had nothing to do with her. James remained calm as he invited the deputies inside and retrieved the thick folder containing his land documents. He spread the survey maps and ownership papers across his table, showing them clearly that not only did he own the cabin, but the surrounding forest, shoreline, and even the road they had driven on. The deputies exchanged looks of surprise, apologized for the interruption, and assured him the matter was resolved. James watched them leave, knowing soon trouble would come when Karen realized her assumptions held no power here. Karen Whitmore was not the kind of person who let things go quietly. The moment the deputies informed her that James claimed to own the entire valley, she felt something inside her twist with indignation. She had spent years building her reputation as the guardian of order within the subdivision, enforcing architectural codes, lawn rules, noise policies, and every tiny regulation she could get her hands on. The idea that someone could live near her community without falling under her authority felt like an insult she couldn't ignore. The next morning, Karen sat at her dining table with a stack of HOA forms spread out like battle plans. She drafted an official violation notice addressed to James, accusing him of multiple infractions: unapproved siting, failure to submit architectural designs, unmaintained natural landscaping, and even unauthorized vehicle storage, though she had no proof of anything. She added fines to each accusation, confident he would take her demands seriously once he saw the paperwork stamped with the HOA seal. She marched to the HOA board members' homes, insisting they sign off on the notice. Most were tired of her constant need for control, but arguing with her was like stepping into a storm. They signed simply to end the conversation. Karen then slipped the notice into a bright yellow envelope and personally delivered it to James's cabin, taping it to his door with exaggerated care. Later that day, James returned from a hike and found the envelope fluttering in the breeze. He read the letter slowly, eyebrows lifting with every accusation. None of it made sense. His land wasn't subject to HOA governance, and Karen clearly hadn't bothered to confirm boundaries or legal authority. He knew she was stubborn, but he hadn't expected her to launch a full crusade. Instead of reacting angrily, James decided to confront the situation calmly. He called Karen using the number listed on the notice. She answered sharply, already speaking over him. BF. Word spread quickly through the subdivision that James had questioned Karen's authority, and by the end of the week, almost everyone had heard some version of the story. Some residents whispered excitedly, wondering if Karen had finally met someone she couldn't intimidate. Others kept their heads down, unwilling to get on her bad side. James, meanwhile, realized he could no longer avoid addressing the situation publicly. Karen's notices kept arriving, 3 more by midweek, each more aggressive than the last, filled with threats of escalating fines and legal consequences. He knew a direct conversation wasn't enough anymore. So when an invitation appeared in his mailbox, requesting his mandatory attendance at the HOA's monthly meeting, James made a decision. He would go, not to fight, but to end the misunderstandings once and for all. He spent the morning preparing, rolling up his large, official valley survey map and gathering the original deed that documented his ownership of thousands of acres. Everything was perfectly legal, recorded, and uncontested. When he entered the HOA community hall, conversations went silent. Karen stood at the front with her clipboard, jaw tight, eyes narrowed as if she had been waiting to pounce. Rows of homeowners sat in folding chairs, watching with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Karen immediately launched into her speech, accusing James of violating community standards, ignoring notices, and disrespecting HOA authority. She spoke quickly and loudly, hoping to overwhelm him before he could respond. But James waited patiently until she finished. Then he unrolled the massive survey map across the table. Gasps rippled through the room as the boundaries became clear. His property encompassed the lake, the surrounding woods, the access road, and stretched far beyond their subdivision. He owned land that the HOA itself used daily. When he placed the official deed beside it, the room fell completely silent. Some board members leaned. Karen left the community hall that night feeling humiliated, but humiliation in her world always transformed into rage. She spent the next morning pacing her kitchen, slamming drawers, brewing coffee she didn't drink, and scribbling plans in her notebook. She refused to accept defeat. In her mind, James had embarrassed her publicly, undermined her authority, and made her look foolish in front of people she had controlled for years. She decided she would not only reassert her power, she would crush any challenge to it. She began by drafting a special emergency resolution, an invented document filled with legal-sounding language about community integrity, environmental compliance, and mandatory homeowner cooperation. She claimed that the HOA had the right to regulate any property that affected the visual harmony of the community, a phrase so vague it could apply to anything from a tree to a mailbox. Karen printed dozens of copies and rushed door to door insisting residents support her. Some reluctantly signed to escape her wrath, others refused, tired of her overreach. The division in the community grew wider. James, on the other hand, expected Karen to retaliate. He visited his attorney, bringing all previous notices, recordings of their conversations, and photos of the envelopes taped to his door. The attorney reviewed everything with raised eyebrows and a slow, disbelieving shake of his head. Karen had not only exceeded her authority, she had violated HOA bylaws, misrepresented property boundaries, and attempted to impose fines where she had zero jurisdiction. It wasn't just annoying behavior, it was potentially illegal. Together, James and his lawyer assembled a detailed report of her actions. They contacted several HOA members privately, sharing the true scope of Karen's misconduct. Shock turned to frustration, then to determination. Many residents admitted they had been silently suffering under her micromanagement for years, threatened with fines for M. The night of the decisive HOA meeting arrived with an unusual tension in the air. Cars lined the small community hall's parking lot, and residents gathered in clusters outside, whispering about what they expected would happen. For years, many of them had attended these meetings reluctantly, forced into silence by Karen's dominating presence and relentless enforcement of rules. But tonight felt different. Tonight, they weren't just attending, they were taking a stand. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was electric. The board members sat stiffly at the front table, papers neatly stacked, eyes shifting nervously. Karen Whitmore stood beside them, gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles were pale. She attempted to greet people with her usual authority, but the room didn't respond with the same fearful compliance. Instead, most residents avoided eye contact, their loyalty finally broken. James entered quietly, taking a seat in the back. He wasn't here to argue or grandstand. His lawyer sat beside him, carrying the thick binder that held every document, transcript, and violation notice they had gathered. James felt a calm certainty settle over him. Whatever happened tonight, it would bring closure. The meeting began with Karen launching into a long, defensive speech about community standards, external threats, and her so-called responsibility to protect property values. She spoke loudly, as if volume could restore the power slipping from her grip. But this time, people didn't nod. They didn't smile. They didn't fear. They listened, arms crossed, waiting. Then the board chair cleared his throat and read aloud the formal complaints filed against Karen, her misuse of authority, her attempts to regulate property she had no jurisdiction over, her intimidation tactics, and her disregard for proper procedure. Each point landed like a hammer. Murmurs filled the room. Karen tried to interrupt, but the chair finally raised his voice and ordered her to sit. After review,